In the old world, people hoarded gold, paper money, and digital numbers, thinking it made them secure. In the apocalypse, gold is just a heavy rock that makes you sink. If you want to survive the freezing dark, you don't need currency. You need teeth. You need ears that can hear a heartbeat at 100 yards. You need a dog. The human body is a masterpiece of thermal engineering, but it is not designed to walk barefoot through a frozen, irradiated wasteland. When I leapt from the 30-foot-high shipping container to escape the slavers at the exchange, the deep snowdrift saved my bones from shattering, but it offered no protection against the catastrophic drop in temperature. I was walking away from the fortified rail yard with nothing. My canvas jacket was torn to shreds by the bullwhip. I had no weapons, no fire starter, and no boots. My bare feet sank deep into the pristine, freezing powder with every step, leaving a vivid trailing ribbon of bright red blood against the white landscape. The adrenaline from the escape was the only thing keeping my heart beating, but adrenaline is a flash fire. It burns bright, consumes your remaining glycogen reserves at a terrifying rate, and then leaves you completely hollow. I moved mechanically, putting one freezing, bleeding foot in front of the other. The wind howled across the flat, dead expanse of the wasteland, driving ice crystals into my face like microscopic needles. I couldn't feel my toes. I couldn't feel my ankles. The terrifying, numb lethargy of late-stage hypothermia was creeping up my calves, turning my legs into heavy, uncoordinated stumps of dead wood. I needed shelter. I needed boots. And I needed them within the hour, or the slavers wouldn't even have to hunt me. The mountain would simply absorb my corpse. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the overwhelming urge to lie down in the soft, deceptive warmth of the snow. About 2 miles from the perimeter of the exchange, the flat wasteland began to roll into a series of jagged, rocky foothills, dotted with the skeletal remains of dead oak trees. Tucked into the base of the nearest hill, partially obscured by a massive snowdrift, I saw a geometric anomaly. It wasn't a rock formation. It was a sharp, man-made angle. I altered my course, dragging my dead, bleeding feet through the snow, forcing my body toward the structure. As I grew closer, the shape resolved into the half-collapsed ruins of an old concrete culvert, likely a drainage pipe for a forgotten highway that had long since crumbled to dust. The entrance was partially blocked by rusted rebar and debris, but it offered a shallow, windbreak cave. It was a desperate, pathetic shelter, but it was out of the howling wind. I staggered toward the dark opening of the concrete pipe, my vision swimming with black spots, my lungs burning with the sub-zero air. "Just get inside," I muttered to myself, the words slurring thickly over my frozen lips. "Get out of the wind. Figure out the rest later." I reached the rusted rebar protruding from the entrance. I grabbed the cold iron to steady myself and peered into the deep shadows of the concrete tunnel. I wasn't the first scavenger to find this shelter. Lying near the back of the culvert, shielded from the worst of the snow, was a human body. It was a man, wrapped in a heavy, insulated military-grade parka. He was sitting slumped against the curved concrete wall, his head resting on his chest, completely motionless. A heavy, scoped hunting rifle lay across his lap. My tactical brain, sluggish from the cold, flared to life. A heavy coat, a firearm, and, most importantly, heavy leather winter boots laced tightly around his feet. He was dead. He had been dead for a while. The snow had drifted in and dusted his shoulders. He had likely succumbed to the cold or a lingering wound. In the mathematics of the wasteland, the dead do not need resources. His coat and his boots were my ticket to surviving the night. I squeezed through the rusted rebar, my bleeding feet leaving dark red smears on the concrete floor of the tunnel. I took 2 steps toward the frozen corpse, reaching my trembling, numb hand out toward the heavy barrel of the hunting rifle. From the absolute pitch-black darkness behind the dead man, a sound erupted. It wasn't a human voice. It was a deep, guttural, vibrating growl that resonated off the curved concrete walls with terrifying acoustic force. It was the sound of a large apex predator warning an intruder that the next step would be fatal. I froze instantly, my hand hovering inches from the rifle. A pair of eyes detached themselves from the shadows. They caught the faint gray light filtering through the entrance, reflecting a harsh, predatory yellow-green glow. A massive shape stepped out from behind the corpse, placing itself directly between me and the dead man's boots. It was a dog, but the word dog implies a domesticated pet. This was a feral, starving beast. It was a German Shepherd mix, its coat matted with blood, dirt, and frozen snow. Its ribs protruded sharply against its flanks, an agonizing portrait of starvation. But despite its emaciated frame, it was terrifying. Its lips were pulled back in a horrific wrinkled snarl, exposing long yellowed canines. Thick saliva dripped from its jaws, freezing before it hit the concrete. Its ears were pinned flat against its skull, its body coiled like a steel spring, ready to launch. I was unarmed, barefoot, and bleeding. And I was trapped in a concrete tube with a starving, highly aggressive predator guarding its dead master. The slaver's snare had been a mechanical trap. But this was a biological standoff. And the dog held all the cards. The silence in the concrete culvert was suffocating, broken only by the low, continuous, vibrating growl vibrating in the dog's chest. I didn't move a single muscle. I didn't breathe. I kept my eyes locked on the animal, avoiding direct, aggressive eye contact but maintaining absolute situational awareness. The dog was starving. The desperate, hollowed-out flanks and the manic, hypervigilant twitch of its ears told a story of profound caloric deficit. In the wild, a starving predator will eventually consume its own dead pack to survive. But this dog hadn't touched the corpse of the man in the parka. It was guarding him. It was protecting a dead master with a fierce, irrational, heartbreaking loyalty that defied every biological instinct of survival. But I didn't have time to admire its loyalty. My core temperature was dropping into the fatal zone. The blood from my torn, bare feet was pooling on the freezing concrete. If I didn't get those leather boots off the corpse within 10 minutes, my toes would blacken and die, and I would be crippled permanently. I slowly lowered my trembling hand, moving it back to my side with agonizing caution. The dog's growl intensified, a sharp, aggressive warning. It took one stiff, calculated step forward, placing its heavy front paws directly onto the dead man's thigh, asserting absolute dominance over the prize. "Easy," I whispered, my voice a dry, ragged rasp. I couldn't fight it. The dog weighed perhaps 80 pounds, even starved. A healthy German Shepherd has a bite force of nearly 240 pounds per square inch, enough to crush the bones in my forearm or tear my throat out in a single violent motion. I had no knife. I had no heavy jacket to sacrifice as a bite sleeve. If the dog lunged in this enclosed space, I was dead. I had to use the only weapon I had left: psychology. I slowly sank to my knees on the cold concrete. It was a massive tactical risk. I was voluntarily surrendering the high ground, lowering my throat to its level, abandoning my mobility. But standing over a dog triggers its defensive aggression. Kneeling makes you smaller, less of a dominating physical threat. The dog didn't stop growling, but the pitch shifted slightly. It watched me intensely, its yellow-green eyes analyzing my posture. I didn't reach for the boots. I didn't reach for the rifle. I reached into the deep, torn pocket of my canvas pants. When I had stripped Caleb of his stolen supplies in the snowy ravine days ago, I had taken my fire starter, my knife, and one other thing. I had gathered a single, massive, jagged shard of the crystallized raw honey that had spilled from the broken plastic buckets. I pulled the jagged amber rock from my pocket. It was the size of my fist, freezing cold and dusted with lint. It was pure, unadulterated, high-density caloric energy. In a world where every living thing was starving to death, it was the holy grail of biology. I held the chunk of crystallized honey in my open palm. I didn't toss it at the dog. Throwing an object triggers prey drive or defensive snapping. I placed the palm of my hand flat on the concrete floor, pushing the chunk of honey forward about 12 inches, keeping my hand totally open and flat. Then I slowly pulled my hand back, leaving the honey resting on the floor between us. The dog stopped growling. Its nose twitched. The canine olfactory system is tens of thousands of times more sensitive than a human's. Through the smell of the freezing wind, the dried blood, and the rotting corpse, the dog instantly registered the massive, overwhelming scent of pure, dense sugar. It looked at the amber rock on the floor. It looked back at me. "Take it," I whispered. The dog's jaw trembled. A thick rope of saliva dropped onto the concrete. The biological imperative to consume calories warred violently with its ingrained duty to protect the dead man. For 30 agonizing seconds, we remained locked in a tense, silent standoff. The wind howled outside the culvert, threatening to blow my remaining body heat away completely. My bare feet were completely numb, a terrifying sign that tissue death was imminent. Finally, the hunger won. The dog took a slow, cautious step forward, its belly low to the ground. It stretched its neck out, its ears still pinned back, its eyes darting nervously between my face and the honey. It opened its powerful jaws, snapped up the jagged rock of crystallized sugar, and instantly retreated backward, cowering behind the corpse to consume the prize. I heard the loud, sharp crunching of the hard sugar breaking against its teeth. It was a trade. I had paid the toll. While the dog was distracted, aggressively chewing the sticky, hard honey, I didn't waste a microsecond. I crawled forward, ignoring the pain in my bleeding knees. I reached the dead man. I didn't touch the heavy hunting rifle yet. The metallic clatter might startle the dog. I grabbed the thick laces of the dead man's heavy leather winter boots. My fingers were clumsy, frozen into stiff claws, but desperation fueled my grip. I untied the knots, loosening the heavy leather tongues. I pulled the boots off the corpse. Underneath, the dead man was wearing thick, heavy wool socks. I stripped those off too. The dog finished the honey. It licked its chops violently, the dense sugar coating its gums. It stepped out from behind the corpse, looking at me. It didn't growl. The aggressive, defensive posture was gone. The sugar had hit its bloodstream, providing a massive, instantaneous spike of energy and endorphins. I wasn't an intruder anymore. I was a provider. I quickly pulled the thick wool socks over my numb, bleeding feet. The friction alone was agonizing, a sharp, burning pain returning to my toes. I shoved my feet into the heavy leather boots and pulled the laces tight. The relief was profound. It wasn't immediate warmth, but it was an impenetrable barrier against the ice. I looked at the dog. It was sitting on its haunches, watching me intently. It was waiting for more. "I don't have any more," I told the animal quietly. I reached out slowly and grasped the heavy, cold barrel of the scoped hunting rifle resting on the dead man's lap. I pulled it toward me. The dog didn't react. The contract had been signed. I checked the breech of the rifle. It was a bolt-action 30-06. A heavy, devastating caliber designed to drop large game at 500 yards. The internal magazine was fully loaded with 4 heavy brass rounds. I had boots. I had a weapon. I had survived the drop. I stood up, wincing as the blood rushed back into my bruised, freezing legs. I looked down at the dead man, and then I looked at the dog. I was about to turn my back and walk out into the wasteland. But leaving the animal in the concrete tube felt like leaving a loaded, priceless weapon behind in the dirt. "You can't guard a ghost," I said to the dog. "He's not waking up." I turned and walked toward the rusted rebar at the entrance of the culvert, stepping out into the biting wind of the open wasteland. I didn't look back. I didn't call to it. A loyal dog isn't commanded. It chooses to follow. I heard the soft, heavy crunch of 4 paws stepping onto the frozen snow behind me. The wasteland is an ocean of frozen white static. Without a compass, without the sun to guide you through the thick, bruised, overcast clouds, a human being will inevitably walk in a massive, slow circle until they freeze to death. Our internal gyroscopes are flawed. We are blind in the snow. But the dog was not blind. I walked away from the concrete culvert, the heavy leather boots of the dead man finally providing a solid, insulated barrier against the ice. The heavy 30-06 hunting rifle was slung across my back. I didn't look over my shoulder for the first mile. I didn't need to. I could hear the rhythmic, heavy crunch of 4 paws pacing me exactly 20 yards back. It didn't walk beside me like a domesticated pet on a leash. It maintained a tactical distance. It was evaluating me just as I was evaluating it. The raw, crystallized honey had forged a temporary treaty, but trust in the apocalypse is not bought with a single meal. It is earned through shared survival. By mid-afternoon, the wind shifted, bringing a heavy, blinding squall of fresh snow that reduced visibility to less than 30 feet. The temperature plummeted. My torn canvas jacket, ruined by Silas's bullwhip at the exchange, offered almost zero protection against the biting wind. I pulled my collar up, squinting into the whiteout, my pace slowing to a desperate crawl. I was completely disoriented. The jagged foothills had vanished into the storm. I was navigating blindly, hoping to stumble into a tree lane or a ruined structure. Suddenly, a dark shape darted past my right leg. The dog pushed ahead of me, moving with shocking speed despite its emaciated frame. It stopped exactly 10 feet in front of me, planting its large paws firmly in the deep snow, and let out a low, sharp bark. I stopped instantly, instinctively reaching for the bolt of the hunting rifle. Through the swirling snow, I couldn't see anything. No slavers. No feral predators. Just an endless, flat expanse of white powder. What is it? I rasped, taking a step forward. The dog snapped its jaws, a violent, aggressive sound, and lunged sideways, intentionally blocking my path. Its hackles were raised, a thick ridge of gray-black fur standing on end along its spine. I froze. I didn't challenge its aggression. I had learned to respect the absolute superiority of its senses. I slowly unslung the heavy hunting rifle. I didn't point it at the dog. I gripped the wooden stock with both hands, using the long, heavy steel barrel like a walking stick. I took one cautious step forward, reaching out with the muzzle of the rifle to probe the pristine, untouched snow directly in front of where the dog was blocking me. The heavy steel barrel didn't meet any resistance. It punched straight through a thin, deceptive crust of ice and completely vanished into the snow. I leaned my weight onto the stock, expecting to hit the frozen earth beneath. There was no earth. The crust of ice shattered under the pressure. A massive, jagged hole opened up in the white landscape, revealing a terrifying, pitch-black void. I threw myself backward, landing hard on my back in the snow, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I crawled to the edge of the hole and looked down. It wasn't a ditch. It was a massive subterranean sinkhole, likely an old collapsed subway tunnel or a deep municipal runoff shaft, completely concealed by the blowing snow. The drop was at least 40 feet straight down into jagged concrete rubble and rusted rebar. If I had taken 2 more steps, I would have plummeted into the dark. My legs would have shattered. I would have died screaming at the bottom of a hole, slowly freezing to death in the pitch black. I pulled myself away from the edge, sitting up in the snow, my breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. I looked at the dog. It had dropped its aggressive posture. It was sitting on its haunches, the wind whipping its matted gray-black coat, watching me with calm, calculating yellow-green eyes. It hadn't smelled a predator. It had heard the hollow echo of the void beneath the ice. It had sensed the structural weakness of the crust. It possessed a biological radar that my human brain couldn't even comprehend. Ash, I whispered, the name coming to me instantly as I looked at its dark, soot-colored fur. I reached out my trembling, freezing hand. I didn't offer food. I offered the back of my hand, a gesture of absolute, terrifying vulnerability. The dog didn't flinch. It leaned forward, pressing its wet, freezing nose against my knuckles. It let out a long, heavy exhale, the hot breath warming my frozen skin. I had been alone for a year. I had trusted a man, and he had locked me in a wooden box to die. I had walked into a human market, and they had put an iron collar around my neck. But as I looked at the starving, feral beast sitting in the blizzard, I realized I had finally found a partner who wouldn't betray me. Ash had just paid me back for the crystallized honey. We were even. I pushed myself to my feet. I didn't try to lead the way anymore. "Find us a way around, Ash," I said. The dog turned, put its nose to the ground, and began to carve a safe path through the whiteout. I followed the wolf, trusting my life entirely to its instincts. Trust is the foundation of an alliance, but protein is the mortar. Ash and I survived the blizzard by taking shelter in the rusted, overturned husk of an old commercial transport truck. We huddled together in the freezing dark, sharing body heat. The dog's thick, matted fur was a miserable substitute for a fire, but the radiant heat of its 80-pound body pressed against my chest kept the hypothermia at bay. When the morning broke, the storm had passed, leaving the wasteland buried under 3 feet of fresh, pristine powder. But the biological clock was ticking loudly. The hyperdense calories from the crystallized honey I had consumed in the ravine had burned off completely. The agonizing, hollow cramps of starvation were twisting my stomach into tight, painful knots. Ash was in even worse shape. The dog's ribs were starkly visible beneath its coat, its gait slightly unsteady as we emerged from the rusted truck. We needed meat. We needed fat. We needed a kill. We moved into a sprawling, ruined suburban development on the edge of the foothills. It was a graveyard of collapsed roofs and shattered windows, choked with snow. In the old world, hunting was a sport of patience and camouflage. In the ash, hunting is a desperate, violent collision of starving predators. I unslung the heavy 30-06 hunting rifle, checking the bolt to ensure a heavy brass round was seated in the chamber. I didn't know how to track an animal through the deep snow. My human eyes were useless in the blinding white glare. But Ash was a biological tracking machine. The dog's posture changed the moment we entered the ruined subdivision. Its nose dropped to the snow, sniffing frantically, its ears swiveling like radar dishes. The lethargy of starvation vanished, replaced by the taut, coiled energy of a hunter. Suddenly, Ash froze. The dog's entire body went rigid, its tail extending straight out, pointing directly toward a thick cluster of dead, overgrown evergreen bushes wedged between 2 burned-out houses. I raised the rifle, pulling the heavy wooden stock tight against my shoulder, peering through the cracked optical scope. I couldn't see anything through the dense, dead branches. Ash didn't wait for my command. The dog didn't bark. It launched itself forward, a silent, gray-black blur tearing through the deep snow with terrifying speed, flanking the bushes from the right side. The tactic was flawless. Ash wasn't trying to catch the prey. The dog was flushing it out, driving it directly into my line of sight. There was a loud crash of breaking branches. A massive shape erupted from the evergreens. It was a whitetail buck, heavily mutated by the radiation of the valley. Patches of its hide were sloughed off, revealing raw, scarred tissue. Its antlers were asymmetrical, twisted and jagged. But despite its sickness, it was massive, easily weighing 200 pounds. It was a mountain of raw, desperate meat. The buck bolted, its hooves kicking up massive plumes of white powder, charging directly across the open snowfield between the ruined houses. Ash was right behind it, snapping viciously at its hind legs, perfectly executing the biological geometry of the hunt, forcing the buck to run in a straight, predictable line to avoid the jaws. I tracked the buck through the scope. I didn't have time to account for windage or elevation. I relied entirely on instinct and the brutal mechanics of the heavy rifle. I exhaled, holding my breath at the bottom of the lungful. The crosshairs settled perfectly just behind the buck's front shoulder, directly over its heart and lungs. I squeezed the trigger. The 30-06 roared, a deafening apocalyptic thunderclap that shattered the silence of the dead suburb. The heavy wooden stock slammed brutally into my bruised shoulder. The heavy caliber bullet hit the buck with the kinetic force of a freight train. The animal's front legs buckled instantly. It crashed headfirst into the deep snow, its momentum carrying it forward in a massive chaotic spray of white powder and bright red blood. I racked the bolt, chambering a second round, keeping the scope trained on the fallen animal. It didn't move. The shot had been a flawless, instantaneous kill. I lowered the rifle and began to slog through the thigh-deep snow toward the carcass. Ash was already there. But the dog wasn't eating. This was the critical moment. In the wild, a starving predator will violently defend its kill against any challenger. I was approaching a feral, starving beast that had just secured a mountain of warm meat. If I reached for my knife, Ash might interpret it as a challenge for dominance, and a fight over the carcass would leave one of us dead. I stopped 10 feet away. I didn't raise the rifle. I unholstered my heavy hunting knife, keeping my hands visible. Ash was standing over the dead buck, its chest heaving, its jaws dripping with saliva. It looked at me. It looked at the meat. I took one slow step forward. Ash let out a soft whine, took a step backward, and sat down in the snow. The dog was voluntarily surrendering the first bite. It recognized the hierarchy of the hunt. It had flushed the prey, but I had delivered the lethal strike. I was the alpha of our microscopic two-man pack. I approached the carcass. I used the heavy hunting knife to quickly, brutally butcher the animal, slicing open the abdominal cavity. The thick metallic steam of warm blood rose into the freezing air. I carved out a massive raw chunk of the nutrient-dense liver. I didn't eat it myself. I turned to Ash, tossing the heavy, bloody slab of meat directly onto the snow in front of the dog. Ash devoured it in 2 violent, desperate bites. I carved another piece for myself, eating the raw, hot meat with animalistic ferocity, ignoring the blood coating my hands and face. We knelt together in the blood-soaked snow, eating in absolute primal silence. We weren't just sharing a meal. We were signing an apex pact. The wasteland had tried to starve us both, and together we had just ripped our survival straight from its throat. Protein is the building block of life, but sleep is the architect of sanity. After we gorged ourselves on the raw venison, I hastily butchered the remaining meat, packing the heavy, bloody cuts into a makeshift sled I fashioned from the buck's own hide. The blood would attract every scavenger within 5 miles, so we couldn't stay in the ruined subdivision. We hauled the meat until dusk, finally finding shelter in a heavily fortified standalone structure that had once been a brick-and-mortar post office. The heavy steel security doors were intact, the reinforced glass windows were barred, and the interior was dry and sheltered from the wind. I dragged the heavy metal sorting tables across the floor to barricade the front door. I built a small, smokeless fire in a metal trash can, using discarded paper and splintered furniture. I cut thick steaks of the venison, searing them on the hot metal lid of the trash can, tossing the scraps and bones to Ash. My stomach was full for the first time in weeks. The small fire radiated a beautiful, localized warmth. The heavy winter boots I had taken from the dead man were drying near the flames. My body was begging for sleep. The exhaustion in my bone marrow was a physical, crushing weight that threatened to pull me into a coma. But my mind was a screaming, paranoid war zone. Every time my eyes began to droop, the trauma of the watchtower flared violently in my skull. I saw Caleb's face. I saw the empty plastic buckets. I felt the agonizing, suffocating panic of waking up locked in the dark, my fire dead, my survival stolen by a man I had trusted. Trusting a human being had nearly killed me. Sleep was a vulnerability I couldn't afford. In the apocalypse, closing your eyes is a roll of the dice with death. I sat against the cold brick wall, the heavy 30-06 rifle resting across my lap, my finger hovering near the trigger guard. I stared into the flickering orange flames of the trash can fire, fighting the heavy, drooping weight of my eyelids. I was determined to stay awake. I would guard my own perimeter. Ash finished gnawing the marrow from a shattered femur bone. The dog licked its chops, stretching its long, lean body. It didn't curl up by the warmth of the fire. Instead, Ash walked deliberately away from the heat. The dog moved to the heavy steel security door I had barricaded. It lay down on the cold linoleum floor, directly across the threshold. Ash rested its heavy head on its front paws, facing the door. Its eyes were closed, but its ears were completely erect, swiveling independently like precise biological radar dishes, tracking every microscopic sound of the wind, the shifting bricks, and the settling ash outside. I watched the dog in the dim light. A profound, staggering realization washed over me, dismantling the paranoid architecture of my trauma. A human guard is a liability. A human guard gets tired. A human guard gets bored. A human guard calculates the mathematics of betrayal, weighing the value of your gear against the value of your life. A dog does none of these things. A dog's loyalty is not transactional. It is absolute. Its hearing is a hypersensitive, infallible alarm system that cannot be bypassed, hacked, or bribed. Ash wasn't guarding the door because the dog wanted my rifle. Ash was guarding the door because I was the pack, and the pack was sacred. If anything, a slaver, a feral dog, a shifting shadow, approached that steel door, Ash would know before it even reached the steps. And Ash would wake me. I looked at the heavy 30-06 across my lap. I slowly engaged the safety mechanism. Click. I placed the rifle on the floor beside me. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around my legs, and closed my eyes. I didn't descend into a fitful, paranoid slumber, listening for footsteps in the dark. I didn't keep one eye open. I surrendered entirely to the exhaustion, trusting my life, my meat, and my perimeter completely to the 80-pound feral beast sleeping at the door. I slept for 10 uninterrupted hours. It was a deep, black, restorative healing that rebuilt the shredded fibers of my sanity. When I finally woke, the fire was nothing but cold gray ash. The morning light filtered weakly through the barred windows. Ash was still lying exactly where I had left the dog, its head resting on its paws, its ears twitching toward the door. In the old world, a dog was a pet, an accessory, a cute companion. In the dead world, I finally understood the truth. A dog is the ultimate survival gear. It is a biological weapon, a flawless radar system, and the only cure for the lethal, crushing weight of isolation. I stood up, my muscles stiff but completely recharged. I grabbed a piece of cold venison from the sled and tossed it to Ash. The dog caught it mid-air. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were a pack. And heaven help the next slaver who tried to put a collar on us. In the wasteland, speed is often a fatal illusion. You can march 20 miles a day and walk directly into an ambush that you could have avoided if you had moved at half the pace and doubled your observation. But observation is limited by the biological hardware of the human skull. We are visual creatures, and in a world blanketed by swirling ash and blinding snow, our primary sense is easily defeated. When you travel with a dog, the entire calculus of the wasteland changes. Your perimeter of awareness instantly expands from 50 visual yards to a mile of olfactory and auditory data. We left the fortified post office 2 days later, pulling the makeshift sled loaded with the frozen butchered venison. The heavy winter boots I had taken from the dead man in the culvert held up against the deep powder, and the heavy 30-06 hunting rifle was slung securely across my chest. Ash didn't walk on a heel command. The dog ranged ahead of me, carving a zigzagging, invisible path through the ruined landscape. It was a masterclass in feral reconnaissance. Ash would disappear over a snowbank, then reappear a minute later, standing on a high point of rubble, ears swiveling, nose testing the wind currents. If the dog's tail was relaxed, the path was clear. If the dog stopped and stared intently into the ruins, I stopped. I didn't question the radar. I simply raised the rifle and waited. On the afternoon of our 4th day together, the radar saved my life. We were navigating a dense, claustrophobic grid of abandoned suburban homes. The snow here had drifted heavily against the rotting fences and burned-out vehicles, creating narrow, twisting channels. I was pulling the heavy sled, sweating under the exertion despite the sub-zero temperatures. The wind was blowing directly in our faces, carrying the faint metallic scent of rusted cars. Suddenly, Ash vanished. The dog had been trotting 20 yards ahead of me, rounding the corner of a collapsed garage. I expected to see the gray-black tail reappear on the other side. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. I stopped pulling the sled. The silence in the suburban grid was heavy, oppressive. I unslung the 30-06 rifle. I didn't rack the bolt. The heavy metallic clack would carry for hundreds of yards in the dead air. I moved slowly, placing my boots carefully in the deep tracks Ash had already carved, minimizing my acoustic footprint. I reached the corner of the collapsed garage. I pressed my back against the frozen, splintered wood, peering around the edge. Ash was standing completely still, frozen in a rigid, aggressive point, exactly 10 feet away. But the dog wasn't pointing at an animal. Ash was pointing directly at a perfectly smooth, undisturbed patch of snow in the narrow channel between 2 houses. I frowned, straining my human eyes to see the anomaly. There was nothing. No movement. No tracks. Just a flat expanse of white powder. But Ash's hackles were raised. The dog's nose was flared, tasting something my human senses were completely blind to. I looked closer, scanning the architecture around the smooth patch of snow. To the left was a burned-out sedan. To the right was a heavy brick chimney that had survived the collapse of the house. And then I saw it. It was a microscopic irregularity in the geometry of the ruins. A thin, nearly invisible filament of fishing line, stretched tight across the channel at ankle height, anchored to the bumper of the sedan and the base of the brick chimney. If I had been walking alone, exhausted and focused on pulling the heavy sled, I would have walked right through it. I traced the fishing line back to its source. It disappeared under the hood of the rusted sedan, connecting directly to the rusted heavy metal pin of an old pre-collapse fragmentation grenade, rigged with heavy-duty duct tape and a mousetrap spring mechanism. It was an anti-personnel tripwire, a perfectly camouflaged, lethal bottleneck designed to shred the legs of any scavenger walking through the channel. And Ash had smelled the ancient, decaying explosive powder, or heard the microscopic vibration of the fishing line in the wind, before my boot was even close. I slowly backed away from the corner. I whistled, a low, barely audible hiss through my teeth. Ash instantly broke the point, backing away from the tripwire and trotting to my side. The dog looked up at me, its yellow-green eyes calm, expecting no reward. It had simply performed its function. "Good dog," I breathed, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs as I realized how close I had just come to losing my legs. We didn't disarm the trap. We bypassed the entire block, taking a wide, arduous detour through the deep snow of the backyards. The heavy 30-06 rifle was a devastating tool of violence, but it couldn't see a tripwire buried in the snow. The hunting knife was a razor-sharp tool of survival, but it couldn't smell explosives in the wind. Gold would have been completely useless, but the dog had just paid for its share of the venison 10 times over. I wasn't just surviving the wasteland anymore. With Ash on the point, I was outsmarting it. We moved higher into the northern foothills, leaving the treacherous, booby-trapped suburbs behind. The terrain grew steeper, the dead pine forests thickening into a dense, blackened wall of skeletal timber. We were putting miles between us and the exchange, but in the apocalypse, distance is not a guarantee of safety. A blood debt in the wasteland is rarely forgiven. When I tore the iron collar off my neck and dropped Silas, the scarred overseer, 30 feet off the edge of the shipping containers, I hadn't just escaped. I had embarrassed a highly organized, heavily armed slaver cartel. I had stolen their inventory, killed their men, and shattered the illusion of their absolute control. They weren't going to let that stand. On the 6th day of our journey, the weather broke. The sky cleared to a piercing, blinding blue, the sun reflecting harshly off the miles of unbroken snow. The air was dead calm, brutally cold, and perfectly still. We had stopped to rest on a high, rocky outcropping that offered a commanding view of the long, winding valley we had just traversed over the last 2 days. I was sitting on the sled, gnawing on a frozen strip of raw venison, letting my aching muscles recover. Ash was sitting beside me, chewing on a heavy femur bone. Suddenly, the dog stopped chewing. The heavy bone dropped from its jaws, hitting the snow with a dull thud. Ash stood up, its entire body tensing like a coiled spring. The dog turned its head, staring back down the long, winding valley we had just climbed. I stopped eating. I didn't see anything. The valley was an empty, pristine expanse of white. But Ash's ears were swiveling violently, locking onto a frequency I couldn't perceive. The dog's nose twitched, pulling in deep, rapid breaths of the freezing air. A low, vibrating growl began deep in its chest, not the aggressive snarl of a hunt, but the deep, warning rumble of an approaching massive threat. "What do you hear, Ash?" I whispered, dropping the venison and reaching for the 30-06 rifle. I raised the heavy weapon, bracing my elbows on my knees, and peered through the cracked optical scope, scanning the valley floor 2 miles below us. At first, there was only the blinding glare of the snow. Then, the magnification caught a microscopic anomaly in the white geometry. It was a dark, moving cluster at the very edge of the tree line. I adjusted the focus, dialing the lenses in tightly. The cluster resolved into shapes. 4 men. They were wearing heavy, matching white and gray camouflage parkas, moving with the disciplined, relentless pace of a professional tracking unit. They carried heavy, scoped assault rifles across their chests. But it wasn't the men that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was what was leading them. Running 50 yards ahead of the tracking party, straining against heavy leather harnesses, were 2 massive armored dogs. They were monstrous, heavily muscled breeds, likely Cane Corsos or Rottweiler mixes, bred for violence and weighed down by thick, spiked leather collars and Kevlar vests. Their heads were down, their noses buried in the deep, heavy trench my sled had carved through the snow. They weren't tracking by sight. They were tracking the scent of the blood from my bleeding feet when I had first escaped, and the scent of the raw venison I was currently hauling. They were the slavers from the exchange. They had followed the ghost. "They have war dogs," I muttered, lowering the rifle, a cold, sharp spike of absolute panic piercing my chest. If it had been just 4 men, I could have used the high ground and the heavy 30-06 to pick them off one by one. But the armored tracking dogs changed the entire tactical equation. Those dogs wouldn't take cover when the shooting started. They would sprint the distance, close the gap in seconds, and tear my throat out while I was trying to cycle the bolt of the rifle. I looked at Ash. My feral, starving companion weighed 80 pounds. The armored war dogs tracking us easily weighed 140 pounds each. They were bred for murder, fed on high-protein diets, and trained to kill uncooperative livestock. If they reached us, Ash would be slaughtered in seconds, and I would be dragged back to the exchange in chains. Running was not an option. The sled tracks were a highway pointing directly to our location. The war dogs would run us down before we reached the next ridge. We couldn't outrun them. We couldn't outshoot them, which meant we had to hunt them. "We're burning the sled," I told Ash, my voice cold and hard. I grabbed my heavy hunting knife. I didn't have time for fear. I had an hour before they crested the foothills. I had to build a slaughterhouse in the snow, and I had to use the slavers' greatest asset, their own tracking dogs, against them. In the mathematics of a tactical ambush, you never fight the enemy on their terms. You manipulate their momentum, you funnel their aggression, and you turn their strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. The slavers from the exchange were tracking the scent of the raw venison loaded on my sled. The massive, armored war dogs were pulling them directly toward the high rocky outcropping. I dragged the makeshift sled, heavy with the remaining butchered meat, to the very edge of a sheer 50-foot vertical drop-off on the side of the rocky outcropping. The drop-off was completely hidden from the valley floor by a thick stand of dead skeletal oak trees. I didn't try to hide the scent. I amplified it. I took my heavy hunting knife and slashed the raw venison, letting the thick, dark blood pool and freeze on the edge of the cliff. The smell of the raw meat in the freezing air was overwhelming. Then I did the hardest thing I had ever done. I grabbed the heavy hide of the sled and shoved the entire massive pile of life-saving calories over the edge of the cliff. The sled plummeted silently, crashing into the jagged, snow-covered rocks 50 feet below, scattering the butchered meat across the base of the drop-off in a massive, bloody explosion of protein. I had just thrown away 2 weeks of survival. But if I didn't kill the trackers, I wouldn't live to see sunset anyway. The trap was baited. The war dogs would track the heavy scent directly to the base of the cliff, where the meat had shattered. The slavers would follow the dogs. They would be forced to bottleneck at the bottom of the ravine to inspect the wreckage of the sled. And I would be waiting 50 feet above them, holding the high ground. I retreated from the edge of the cliff, crawling on my belly through the deep snow until I found a perfect elevated firing position behind a massive V-shaped boulder. The rock offered total concealment and a flawless downward trajectory directly into the kill zone at the base of the cliff. I chambered a heavy brass round into the 30-06. I clicked the safety off. I looked at Ash. The dog was lying flat in the snow beside me, its gray-black fur blending perfectly with the shadows of the boulder. Its ears were pinned back, its body vibrating with the terrifying, silent intensity of a predator waiting for the strike. "Stay," I commanded, pressing a firm, reassuring hand against the dog's rigid shoulder. "Do not move. Let them take the bait." Ash didn't whine. The dog understood the absolute gravity of the silence. We waited in the freezing white void. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dead branches of the oak trees, masking the sound of our breathing. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. Then, the silence of the mountain was shattered. It wasn't a human voice. It was the deep, terrifying, echoing bark of a massive canine, followed instantly by another. The war dogs had found the blood. I pressed my eye against the cracked optical scope, aiming straight down into the ravine. The 2 massive armored dogs burst through the tree line at the base of the cliff, their spiked leather collars glinting in the pale sunlight. They hit the shattered remains of the venison sled, plunging their heavy jaws into the raw meat, tearing at the bloody snow with chaotic, manic violence. 10 seconds later, the 4 slavers emerged from the trees, jogging heavily, their assault rifles raised, following the tight leashes of the dogs. "They dumped the cargo," one of the slavers yelled, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He wore a white camouflage parka and a heavy tactical helmet. The sled went over the edge. "Look up." They realized the tactical error immediately. They had followed the scent into a blind ravine with a 50-foot vertical wall in front of them. The leader, a massive man with a heavy suppressed assault rifle, looked directly up the cliff face, sweeping his weapon toward the V-shaped boulder where I was hiding. "Spread out," the leader roared. "He's up there." He was fast, but gravity and velocity are absolute. I didn't aim for his chest. I aimed directly for the center of his heavy tactical helmet. I pulled the trigger. The 30-06 roared, a deafening apocalyptic thunderclap that physically shook the snow loose from the oak trees. The heavy caliber bullet, designed to shatter the shoulders of elk, impacted the slaver's helmet with catastrophic kinetic force. The Kevlar shattered, and the man was thrown violently backward into the deep snow, dead before his body hit the ground. The ambush was sprung. The remaining 3 slavers panicked. The deafening echo of the rifle shot bouncing off the canyon walls completely disoriented them. They didn't know exactly where the shot had come from. They dove for cover behind the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff, raising their assault rifles and firing blindly up the mountain. Automatic weapons fire shredded the dead branches above my head, raining heavy splinters of wood and pulverized ice down onto my canvas jacket. I racked the bolt. The heavy brass casing ejected, hissing as it hit the snow. I chambered the second round. But the slavers weren't just shooting. "Release the hounds," one of them screamed from behind a rock. "Let them climb." I heard the heavy metallic clack of the carabiners detaching from the leashes. The 2 massive armored war dogs, furious from the noise and the smell of blood, were suddenly untethered. They didn't cower from the gunfire. They charged the cliff face. They were bred for this. They hit the steep, jagged rocks of the incline and began to scramble upward with terrifying muscular speed, their heavy claws digging into the ice, their eyes locked on the top of the ridge. I couldn't shoot them. They were moving too fast, a blur of armor and muscle zigzagging up the rocks. If I wasted a round on the dogs, the slavers below would have the suppression necessary to flank my position. The first armored dog crested the ridge, its massive jaws snapping, its eyes wild with homicidal rage. It saw me behind the boulder, 30 feet away. It lowered its head and charged, 140 pounds of armored death closing the gap in 2 seconds. I couldn't cycle the bolt fast enough. But I didn't have to. From the shadows beside me, a silent gray-black blur erupted. Ash didn't bark. Ash didn't hesitate. The starving feral dog launched itself directly into the path of the massive armored beast, colliding with it in a horrific, violent explosion of fur, teeth, and blood. The collision of the 2 canines was a terrifying primeval sound, a sickening crunch of bone ripping flesh and deafening guttural roars. Ash, weighing 80 pounds and half-starved, was entirely outmatched by the 140-pound armored war dog. But Ash possessed something the slaver's beast did not, the absolute suicidal ferocity of a wolf protecting its pack. Ash didn't try to bite through the thick Kevlar vest or the spiked leather collar. The feral dog went under the armor, launching a devastating upward strike, sinking its long yellow canines deep into the unprotected soft tissue of the war dog's front shoulder, locking its jaw with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. The massive war dog roared in agony, its momentum shattered. It thrashed violently, lifting Ash completely off the ground and slamming the smaller dog brutally into the jagged granite of the boulder. Crack! Ash whimpered a sharp, high-pitched sound of pain, but the jaw remained locked. Ash refused to let go, acting as a living, bleeding anchor, preventing the armored beast from reaching me. The second armored war dog crested the ridge, its heavy claws scrabbling on the ice. It saw Ash pinned to its packmate, lowered its massive head, and charged to tear Ash apart. I didn't let that happen. The first dog was too close, moving too erratically, but the second dog was charging in a straight line. I swung the heavy barrel of the 30-06, tracking the armored chest of the second dog. I squeezed the trigger. The massive recoil slammed into my bruised shoulder. The heavy brass bullet caught the charging war dog directly in the center of its Kevlar vest. The armor stopped penetration, but it couldn't stop the horrific kinetic transfer of the high-velocity round. The impact shattered the dog's ribcage, throwing it violently backward, a broken, wheezing heap in the snow. Shuck shuck. I racked the bolt. 2 rounds left. Below, the 3 remaining slavers had located my position from the muzzle flash. He's behind the Vrock. Suppress him. A terrifying hail of automatic 5.56 gunfire rained against the front of the V-shaped boulder. The heavy, high-velocity rounds chipped massive chunks of granite off the rock, showering me in blinding stone shrapnel. I was completely pinned down. If I raised my head above the rock to fire, my skull would be pulverized. To my left, the horrific dogfight was reaching its brutal conclusion. The first war dog, bleeding heavily from the shoulder, finally managed to twist its massive neck. It clamped its jaws down with crushing force onto Ash's hind leg. I heard the sickening sound of bone splintering. Ash let out a devastating, agonized scream, finally releasing the grip on the war dog's shoulder. The armored beast violently tossed the smaller dog aside. Ash hit the snow hard, leaving a massive spray of dark red blood across the pristine powder, desperately trying to drag its shattered leg backward. The armored war dog, dripping blood but victorious, turned its homicidal gaze back to me. It gathered its massive hind legs, preparing to lunge over the boulder and tear my throat out. I didn't have time to aim the rifle. I didn't have time to cycle the bolt. I dropped the 30-06. I drew my heavy hunting knife from my thigh sheath in a fraction of a second, gripping the brass pommel tightly. The war dog launched itself over the rock, a terrifying mountain of muscle and Kevlar sailing through the air, its jaws wide open. I didn't retreat. I dropped onto my back in the snow, bringing both knees up to my chest. As the massive dog descended upon me, I kicked upward with all my remaining strength, planting the heavy leather winter boots squarely into the dog's armored chest, using its own forward momentum to flip it over my head. The dog crashed onto its back in the snow behind me. Before it could roll over, I scrambled to my knees, lunged forward, and drove the heavy 6-inch carbon steel blade directly into the exposed, unprotected flesh of its throat, just below the spiked leather collar. I twisted the knife violently, severing the jugular and the windpipe. Hot, pressurized arterial blood sprayed across my hands and face. The massive beast shuddered violently, let out a wet, gurgling sigh, and went entirely limp in the snow. I ripped the knife free, wiping the blood from my eyes. I grabbed the 30-06 rifle. The automatic gunfire from the slavers below had paused. They were reloading. It was a fatal 3-second window. I threw myself out from behind the cover of the V-shaped boulder, exposing myself completely on the edge of the cliff. I didn't use the scope. I looked down into the ravine. The 3 slavers were crouching behind the rocks, dropping empty magazines into the snow. I fired. The heavy round caught the closest slaver in the chest, dropping him instantly. Shuck shuck. The second slaver managed to raise his rifle, but panic ruined his aim. A burst of fire went wide, snapping past my shoulder. I squeezed the trigger. My last round. It hit the second slaver in the throat. He collapsed backward, clutching his neck. The third slaver didn't try to shoot. He saw his entire unit annihilated, his war dogs dead, and his heavy firepower rendered completely useless by a single man with a bolt-action rifle. He dropped his assault rifle into the snow, turned, and sprinted back toward the tree line in absolute blind terror. I didn't reload. I didn't chase him. Let him run back to the exchange and tell Silas's ghost that the meat shoots back. The mountain was utterly silent again, save for the howling wind and the faint, agonizing whimpers coming from the bloody snow to my left. I dropped the empty rifle. I ignored the dead slavers. I ignored the massive haul of weapons and gear waiting in the ravine. I dropped to my knees and crawled frantically toward the dark, bleeding shape in the snow. The ambush was won, but the cost was devastating. In the old world, when a tool broke, you discarded it. In the wasteland, you fix it or you die. But Ash wasn't a tool. Ash was the pack. And you do not abandon the pack. I reached the dog. Ash was lying on its side in the freezing, blood-soaked powder. The gray-black fur was completely matted with crimson. The damage was horrific. The heavy jaws of the armored war dog had crushed Ash's right hind leg. The bone wasn't severed, but it was shattered, the leg hanging at a sickening, unnatural angle. Deep, jagged lacerations crisscrossed the dog's flank. Ash was shivering violently, the shock of the trauma and the rapid blood loss plunging the animal into severe hypothermia. Despite the agonizing pain, as I knelt beside it, Ash didn't growl. The dog didn't snap at my reaching hands. It looked up at me with pale, exhausted yellow-green eyes and let out a soft, pathetic whine, thumping its tail once against the snow. It was a gesture of absolute, heartbreaking trust. "I've got you," I whispered, my voice thick, my bloody hands shaking as I gently ran my fingers over the shattered leg. "I'm not leaving you. I've got you." I pulled the heavy canvas jacket off my back, exposing my arms to the sub-zero wind. I carefully slid the thick fabric under Ash's trembling body, wrapping the heavy coat tightly around the dog to trap whatever meager body heat remained. I couldn't treat the leg in the snow. The cold would kill us both within the hour. We needed shelter. We needed a fire. I looked down into the ravine. The slavers lay dead in the snow. They wore heavy, insulated winter parkas. They carried medical kits. They had matches, weapons, and radios. It was a king's ransom of survival gear, easily worth a fortune in the dead world. I ignored all of it. I didn't climb down to loot the corpses. Gold, ammunition, and gear are completely useless if you are alone, deaf, and blind in the dark. I carefully scooped Ash into my arms, lifting the 80-pound dog against my chest. The animal whimpered, burying its bloody nose into my neck. The weight was staggering, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I turned my back on the cliff edge and the dead slavers. I began the agonizing, slow march back down the ridge, carrying my bleeding radar system through the deep snow. It took me 2 hours to find an old, partially collapsed hunting cabin tucked into a dense grove of pine trees. The roof was sagging, but the heavy log walls were intact, and there was a rusted iron wood stove in the corner. I laid Ash gently on the dusty floorboards. I worked with frantic, manic speed. I gathered dry pine needles and broken floorboards, using my magnesium striker to ignite a blazing hot fire inside the iron stove. The cabin rapidly filled with glorious, life-saving heat. I knelt beside Ash. I had no sterile bandages. I had no antibiotics. But I had the memory of Elias, the old history teacher, and the horrific surgery I had performed on him in the concrete bunker. I pulled out my heavy hunting knife. I used the blade to carefully, precisely cut away the matted, bloody fur around the deep lacerations on Ash's flank and leg. I reached into the deep pocket of my pants and pulled out the massive, jagged shard of raw, crystallized honey I had taken from Caleb in the ravine. It was my only food. It was the calories I needed to survive the next 3 days. I didn't hesitate. I placed the chunk of amber glass into a scavenged metal tin and set it directly on top of the hot iron wood stove. I watched the dense sugar melt into a thick, boiling, golden syrup. I went outside and scooped a handful of clean, sterile hardwood ash from a dead campfire ring near the cabin. I brought it inside, mixing the black carbon powder directly into the boiling honey, creating a thick, gritty, jet-black paste. "This is going to burn," I whispered to Ash, holding the dog's head gently. I packed the boiling, hyperosmotic, antibacterial black tar directly into the deep, bleeding wounds on the dog's leg and flank. Ash didn't scream. The dog tensed violently, its jaw locking shut against the agonizing, searing pain of the sugar attacking the raw nerve endings, but it didn't pull away. It trusted the hands that were causing the pain. I used strips of torn fabric from my own shirt to bind the shattered leg, pulling it as straight as I could, creating a crude, tight splint to immobilize the bone. When I finished, Ash was encased in a localized black carapace of dried honey and ash, exactly like Elias had been. The bleeding had stopped. The wound was sealed from the stagnant air and the bacteria of the cabin. I slumped back against the log wall, utterly exhausted, my bare arms shivering despite the heat of the stove. I had no food. My jacket was wrapped around a bleeding dog. I had thrown a mountain of meat off a cliff. But as I looked at Ash, lying by the fire, breathing slowly, steadily, recovering in the warmth, I didn't feel poor. I didn't feel desperate. I felt incredibly, overwhelmingly rich. In the apocalypse, currency is an illusion. Ammunition runs out. Food rots. Fortresses are breached. But a loyal dog is an invaluable, irreplaceable asset. It is a companion that will stand between you and a charging monster. It is a radar that will hear a tripwire in a blizzard. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the heavy timber wall. The howling wind battered the cabin, but the fire burned hot. I wasn't just a solitary scavenger anymore. We were a pack. And as long as we were breathing, the wasteland would have to fight both of us. #video end.